My house was reduced to ashes by a devastating fire. At 65, I had no choice but to seek shelter at my son's home, but he turned me away, saying his girlfriend needed privacy. Desperate, I picked up the phone and dialed the number of that young love of mine, a man I had not seen in 4 decades. When he opened the door of his mansion, he spoke 3 words I will never forget. "You finally came back." Then he added, "My life changed forever." But before I continue, make sure you are subscribed to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far our stories reach. My name is Mary, and at 65, I thought I had endured every kind of sorrow life could throw at me. I was wrong. It all started on a Wednesday that seemed like any other in Denver. I was in the kitchen making my afternoon coffee when a strange smell reached me. I thought perhaps I had left something on the stove and went to check. When I opened the living room door, a cloud of smoke so thick met me that I could barely see what was in front of me. Flames were already devouring the curtains and climbing the walls with a speed that froze me for a few crucial seconds. The smoke detector should have gone off, but I would later learn its battery had been dead for months. One simple oversight that was about to cost me everything I owned. I ran back to the kitchen trying to reach the phone to call the fire department, but the smoke filled everything, making it hard to breathe and fogging my mind. I heard glass breaking and realized there was no time. The fire moved with a veracity that could not be contained. My only thought was to get out alive. I grabbed my purse from the kitchen table and ran for the back door. The last thing I saw before fleeing was the portrait of Robert, my late husband, blackening under the searing heat. Neighbors were already in the street when I managed to get out, coughing and staggering. Mrs. Thompson, my 78-year-old neighbor, was the first to come over. She hugged me tight as we both watched helplessly while the flames swallowed the house where I had lived for more than 40 years. The firefighters took 10 minutes to arrive, but it was already too late. They managed to prevent the blaze from spreading to neighboring houses, though mine was doomed. In barely an hour, 40 years of memories were reduced to ashes. The kitchen table where Michael did his homework, the walls that bore the marks of his growth, the room I shared with Robert for 37 years, it was all gone. I stood on the sidewalk wrapped in a blanket someone had put around my shoulders while the firefighters did their work. Later they would tell me the most likely cause was a short circuit in an old living room outlet. A simple electrical fault turned into total ruin. The flames finally died down, leaving behind only a blackened, smoking shell. The fire chief came up to me with his face smudged and eyes full of a compassion I could not bear at that moment. "I am so sorry, ma'am. We did what we could," he said, though he didn't need to finish the sentence. I could see it myself, total loss. Everything I owned, apart from the clothes I was wearing and what was in my purse, had disappeared. That first night, a few neighbors who had been lucky enough to save their homes took me in. Kind Mrs. Thompson insisted I stay with her, but her small apartment was already full of grandchildren visiting. The Red Cross had set up emergency shelters, though the idea of sleeping in a gym surrounded by strangers made me feel even more abandoned. That was when I realized I had to call Michael. My son lived about 40 minutes away in Austin, in a nice neighborhood with tree-lined streets and houses that looked like they came from a magazine. He had moved there 4 years ago when he was promoted to regional manager at the insurance company where he worked. We were not very close, not in the way a mother and son should be, but he was the only family I had left. I used Mrs. Thompson's phone because mine had melted along with everything else. "Michael dear, it's Mom," I said in a voice weaker than I expected. "Mom, what happened? You sound upset." "There was a fire, son. The house is gone. Everything is gone." There was a pause that felt endless. "Are you hurt?" "No, I'm all right. Just some scratches and a throat irritated by smoke, but I need somewhere to stay while I sort things out. It will only be temporary." Another pause. "Of course, Mom. Come, we'll fix this." The relief I felt was so intense I almost collapsed. My son would take care of me. Despite the distance that had grown between us, the missed calls and the awkward family dinners, he was still my boy. The next morning I spent staring at the charred ruins, waiting for the insurance adjuster. He arrived promptly at 9. A young man who seemed to want to be anywhere else, walking through what remained of my house with a clipboard and a camera in hand. "Total loss," he said in a pragmatic tone, as if those 2 words did not sum up my whole life. "How much?" I asked, dreading the answer. Well, your policy covered about $2 million for the structure, but with the deductible and depreciation we're talking about maybe $900,000, perhaps less. $900,000 to rebuild 42 years of life. Felt impossible. Mrs. Thompson helped me buy some basic clothes and toiletries with the emergency money the Red Cross gave me. Everything I own now fit into a small borrowed suitcase. That was all I had left of the life I had built. The trip to Michael's house felt like going to a foreign country. Everything looked different when you no longer had a home to return to. The familiar places, the gas station where I used to buy my lottery tickets, the diner where Robert and I had Sunday breakfasts, had all become memories of another life. Michael's neighborhood, on the other hand, was pristine as always. Perfect lawns, clean sidewalks, perfect lives that continued exactly the same as the day before. I felt like an intruder, bringing my tragedy into their immaculate world. His was a two-story colonial with white shutters and a red front door chosen by Sarah, his girlfriend. I had seen Sarah exactly 3 times in the 2 years she had been with my son. She was 30 and he was 39. She worked at a marketing firm downtown and had opinions about everything, from wall colors to which wine should be served at dinner. The taxi pulled up at the house and I stood still for a moment, gathering my courage. This is only temporary, I repeated to myself, just until I could figure out what would come next, until the insurance money arrived and I could rent a small apartment somewhere. I never imagined that walking up to my son's front door, carrying a borrowed suitcase, would be one of the hardest decisions of my entire life. When I raised my hand to knock, I was overtaken by a familiar feeling. The same emptiness I felt when Robert died. As if the ground had opened beneath my feet. I did not yet know how deep the abyss I was about to fall into would be. Michael opened the door before I could knock, as though he had been watching from the window. For an instant, seeing his familiar face, those eyes that reminded me of Robert, that stubborn chin he had inherited from me, made me believe that maybe everything would be all right. He was my son, my only son. And blood, I thought, ought to mean something. "Mom," he said, stepping aside to let me in, though there was something strange in his voice, perhaps distance, perhaps discomfort. Sarah appeared behind him almost immediately, as if she had been waiting for the moment. She wore white jeans and a silk blouse that surely cost more than I would spend on groceries in a month. Her brown hair was tied up in one of those messy buns that somehow look perfectly styled, and her smile was one of those that never reached the eyes. "Mary, how terrible about your house," she said. But her gaze was fixed on my worn-out suitcase, not on me. Michael explained what had happened. I placed my suitcase in the spotless entryway of his home, suddenly aware of how out of place it looked. My freshly bought, simple, cheap clothes contrasted with the gleaming marble of the hallway. Even though I had showered at Mrs. Thompson's, I could still smell the smoke clinging to my hair. "It's only temporary," I said quickly, "just until I can get back on my feet." Michael and Sarah exchanged a look. It was one of those silent conversations only couples understand, shutting everyone else out. I had shared looks like that with Robert in the past, but now, seeing it from the other side, I felt with painful clarity how they were excluding me from a circle I would never belong to. "Let's sit down and talk," Michael said, guiding me into the living room. The house was beautiful, the kind you see in home design magazines. Everything was perfectly coordinated, not a single item out of place. The white furniture looked untouched, as if no one had ever sat on it. The glass coffee tables reflected the light streaming in from windows so clean they seemed invisible. It was a home that made you afraid to touch anything, for fear of ruining its perfection. I sat stiffly on the edge of the white sofa, careful not to scuff the pristine wooden floor with my new shoes. Sarah noticed and tightened her lips slightly. "So what's the plan?" Michael asked as he settled into an armchair across from me. Not beside me, where he could have embraced his mother who needed him, but across from me, as if we were at a formal meeting. "Well," I began, "the insurance adjuster told me the process will take a few weeks, maybe a month. I was hoping I could stay here during that time, just until I can find a small apartment or something similar." The silence that followed lasted much longer than expected. I watched Sarah's face harden. I saw her jaw tighten ever so slightly. She placed her hand on Michael's arm, a gesture that looked supportive but felt possessive. "Mom," Michael began, and the moment I heard his tone I knew what he was about to say would break my heart. "The problem is Sarah and I have talked about this a lot. and we really need our privacy. We work long hours and this house is our refuge, if you understand. I blinked in confusion. I would not disrupt their lives. I could stay in the background, help with cooking, with cleaning. I would not be a burden. Sarah leaned forward and spoke in a gentle but firm voice. It's not about you being a burden, Mary, it's about space. This is our first home together, and we're still finding our balance as a couple. I am his mother, I replied, my words sharper than I intended. Of course you are, Sarah answered in the same calm tone. And that's why we think you'd be more comfortable somewhere else, in a place where you could have your independence while rebuilding your life. I looked at Michael, waiting for him to contradict her, to remember that I was the woman who had stayed up with him through every illness, who had worked double shifts to pay for his education, who had stood by him through his divorce when his ex-wife left him for someone else. But he only nodded. Sarah is right. Mom, we think you'd be happier with your own space. The words hit me like a punch. My chest tightened as though the air had been sucked out. Happier, Michael? I lost absolutely everything yesterday. And you think I would be happier alone in a hotel room than here with my family? Not necessarily a hotel, Sarah quickly interjected. There are extended stay places near the mall. They're clean, safe, and they have small kitchens so you can cook your own meals. I stared at her in disbelief. This woman, who had been in my son's life for only 2 years, thought she could decide where I should live after I had lost everything. And how am I supposed to pay for that charming extended stay place? The insurance money won't come for weeks. Michael shifted uneasily in his seat. I could help with that. A few $100s to get you started. Just enough to get you settled. A few $100s. As though I were a stranger he barely owed a hand to. Michael, I whispered, barely audible. I changed your diapers, stayed up with you through fevers, taught you how to ride a bike, helped you with your homework, held you when you cried because Sarah broke your heart back in school. I saw his face tighten, but Sarah gripped his arm firmly. No one questions your history, she said calmly. We just think we'd all be more comfortable if we set certain boundaries. Boundaries. I remembered that word in the mouth of the therapist Michael saw after his divorce. Everything revolved around boundaries. You're kicking me out, I said flatly. No, Mom, that's not it, Michael protested. We just think this arrangement isn't the best for any of us. Whose idea was this? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Sarah leaned back slightly, satisfied as if she had won something. We talked it over together, Michael replied, avoiding my eyes. I rose slowly, my knees cracking, reminding me that I was 65 and completely alone. I understand. Mom, don't take it that way. We're just trying to do what's best for everyone. What's best for everyone? I repeated quietly, as though the words were in a language I could not understand. And what's best for everyone is that your mother has nowhere to sleep tonight? Sarah's perfectly made-up face tensed with discomfort. It's not necessary for you to sleep on the street. Like I said, there are options. I looked around one last time. The immaculate living room, the photos of Michael and Sarah but none of me, the luxurious furniture no one actually used. And my son, who had chosen that woman over me. You're right, I finally said. There are always options. I picked up my suitcase. Its weight felt heavier now that I knew I wasn't welcome in that house. Michael stood, uneasy, though not uneasy enough to take it back. I'll call you in a few days once you get settled somewhere. Don't bother, I answered with a firmness that surprised me. I don't want to invade your sanctuary. Sarah showed a flicker of shame but said nothing. She didn't have the courage to admit the obvious, that the situation was wrong, that I was his mother. I left that perfect house with its perfect couple and their perfect boundaries. I stood on the sidewalk a long time before I could bring myself to move. From the window I saw them talking, probably remarking on how difficult it all was, how much drama I was bringing into their quiet lives. The irony hit me hard. I had spent years after Robert's death telling myself I was strong, independent, that I didn't need anyone. Now, at the very moment I needed help most, I discovered that independence is a luxury reserved for those with options. I walked to a small hotel on the corner and spent almost all the money I had left on a room. That hard bed, those peeling walls, became my makeshift refuge as I wondered what future awaited a 65-year-old woman with nothing but a borrowed suitcase full of cheap clothes and nearly no money. It was then that I remembered that business card I had kept in my wallet for almost 40 years, which had miraculously survived because I had it with me at the time of the fire. The paper, yellowed with time and worn from being handled so many times, seemed too fragile to hold such a powerful memory. I never thought I would actually use it. It belonged to a man I had loved when everything was new and the world seemed full of promise. It was Richard, the man who once swore he would come back for me. One day before life got in the way and that return never happened. I spent 3 nights in that cheap hotel before finding the courage to dial his number. 3 nights waking with back pain from the too hard mattress, with the taste of shame in my mouth. 3 nights hearing arguments in the hallway, and the constant noise of cars passing the poorly insulated window. 3 nights washing my few clothes in the tiny bathroom, and hanging them on the only chair to dry. The card, worn by 4 decades of waiting, felt like a piece of tissue paper between my fingers. In faded blue letters you could still read, Richard. Below was a phone number with an area code I didn't even recognize. On the back, in my young, hopeful handwriting, I had written, "Never forget E." I had written it at 25, convinced with the naivete of youth that Richard was the great love of my life. He was 26 then, with dark hair falling over his forehead and amber eyes that took my breath away. He worked at his father's construction company after finishing college, though he always dreamed of bigger projects, of building something that would truly leave a mark. We dated for 9 months, a time that at 25 felt like forever. He would take me to a lookout on the edge of the city, where we would sit on the hood of his car and talk about our future. "I'm going to start my own company," he would tell me. "Something in construction, in real estate development. I want to be rich enough to give you everything you deserve. I'll come back for you, Mary." That was his promise the night before leaving for a project in New York. "I'll make something of myself, and when I return we'll get married." But promises made at 25 often fade when real life steps in. At first he wrote me long letters full of plans and dreams. I answered, telling him about my job at the bank and how I was waiting for him, keeping the promise I had made. With time those letters grew shorter and less frequent. 6 months later I met Robert at a church gathering. By then Richard already felt like a beautiful distant memory, too good to be real. Robert, at 32, was a reliable man with a steady job at the phone company. He didn't promise me the world, but he offered me a home, a family, stability. After 5 months of dating, he asked me to marry him and I accepted. On my wedding day I carried Richard's card hidden in the pocket of my dress, like a secret talisman I didn't dare part with. Now, for decades later, in a hotel room smelling of damp and stale smoke, I wondered what had become of that young dreamer with amber eyes. Over the years I heard of him sporadically, as often happens with first loves. Through mutual friends I learned he had fulfilled his promises, founded his own construction company, and found success. He never married, which surprised many. They said he was too busy building his empire. He had always been ambitious, they would comment. The last news I had, about 8 years ago, was that his company, Anderson Construction, had expanded beyond Denver, reaching as far as New York and Chicago. He was building shopping centers and office complexes. That young man who had started out working in his family's business had become an executive in expensive suits, making decisions that affected hundreds of lives. And I asked myself, what would a man like that want with a 65-year-old widow staying in a cheap hotel, with nothing more than a suitcase full of supermarket clothes? The rational part of my mind told me it was absurd, even pathetic. You don't call someone after 40 years just because your life has collapsed. You don't reach out to a lost love when you are older, vulnerable, and adrift. But reason is a luxury when you're counting the coins in your purse to see if you have enough to pay for one more night in a hotel. On the 4th morning I couldn't take it anymore. My back ached, my money was running out, and the hotel clerk had already warned me they needed the room for another reservation. I sat at the small table in my room, the card trembling in my hands. What could I say? "Hello, Richard. Do you remember me? I have nowhere to live now. Can you help me?" Most likely the number no longer existed. Perhaps a secretary would answer and politely tell me that Mr. Richard was too busy to take calls from strange women claiming to have known him in his youth. But what if not? What if it was him who answered? With my heart racing, I dialed the number. Each digit felt like jumping into a void. 1 ring, 2. And then, "Anderson Construction, this is Richard speaking." His voice, deeper now and shaped by the years, was still unmistakable. I would have recognized it anywhere, even after 40 years. I nearly hung up, nearly pressed the button and erased it all. But there was something in his tone, a warmth that traveled through the phone and wrapped around me like an embrace. Richard, it's me, Mary. Mary Thompson. Well, now I'm Mary Johnson, but before I was Thompson. There was such a long silence that I thought maybe the call had dropped, or that he had hung up, or that he no longer knew who I was. And then I heard my name. Mary. He said it like a prayer, as if he could not believe it. I rushed to speak, afraid he would cut me off. I'm sorry for calling like this. I know it's been forever and I probably shouldn't have, but I didn't know who else to turn to. Where are you? His voice, clear and worried, cut me off. I'm in Austin at a hotel called the Hope Inn. I know it sounds crazy, but my house burned down last week. I lost everything. And my son doesn't want me to stay with him. I have nowhere to go. The words poured out like a torrent, each more painful than the last. Admitting your own son rejected you was to confess a failure too big to bear. Give me the exact address, Richard said, now with a completely professional tone. I'm coming to get you. You don't have to do that. I don't even know why I called. I guess I just needed to hear a friendly voice. Mary. His tone left no room for debate. Tell me where you are. I'm already on my way. I heard on the other end the slam of a door and the roar of a car starting. He was really coming. This man I hadn't spoken to in 40 years had dropped everything to come find me at a cheap hotel. I whispered the address. Richard, I don't look. I'm not the girl you remember. I'm not the same either, he replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. But I've been waiting 40 years for this call. I hung up trembling and spent the next hour packing my meager belongings, torn between panic and disbelief. What was I doing? What were we doing? It was madness to think of resuming something after 4 decades, as if it were simply continuing a conversation paused the day before. But as I looked out the hotel window, waiting for a car I didn't know and a man who might not even recognize me, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the fire, hope. Maybe naive, maybe bound to end in disappointment, but hope nonetheless. And at 65, with nothing else to lose, hope was worth the risk. At exactly 10:45, a silver Cadillac pulled up in front of the hotel, gleaming brightly and standing out against the rundown street. I watched from the window as it parked, my heart pounding against my ribs like a bird desperate to escape its cage. The tinted windows hid the interior, but something deep inside me told me it was him. The engine turned off and the driver's door opened slowly. Despite the 4 decades that had passed, despite the gray hair and the lines etched into his face, despite the weight of years I had not shared with him, I recognized him instantly. Richard stepped out of the car as though he had emerged from my own memories, and the moment he lifted his gaze toward the window where I stood, the years seemed to disappear between us as if they had never existed. I grabbed my suitcase quickly and hurried down the stairs with the urgency of someone afraid a dream will vanish if she waits too long. He was there, standing calmly beside the car. Richard still carried that same easy confidence he had when he was 26, but now it was refined, polished by maturity and the achievements of the years. He wore dark jeans and a navy sweater that surely cost more than I used to spend on an entire month of groceries. Yet his eyes, those amber eyes that had haunted my dreams for decades, were unchanged. A part of me wanted to hide, to go back to the hotel room and pretend none of this was happening. I felt I looked terrible. My hair hadn't been cut in months, my simple, cheap clothes were wrinkled, and I felt small and insignificant next to the elegant man waiting for me. But he was already smiling at me, with a smile that made my heart leap as if I were 25 again. I walked toward him slowly, suddenly unable to breathe properly. "Hello, Mary," he said softly. Standing so close, I could see the changes time had left on him. His dark hair had turned silver, cut professionally, short and neat. The wrinkles framed his eyes and traced his mouth. His shoulders were broader, his body more solid, as though success had also given him physical presence. But when he smiled, I saw again the young man who used to take me to the lookout to tell me his dreams. "Hello," I managed to reply, my voice barely audible. He studied my face for a long moment, his amber eyes attentive to every detail. I wanted to apologize for my appearance, for how far I had fallen, for calling him after so many years with nothing to offer but problems. Yet he spoke 3 words that changed everything. "You look beautiful." At that moment I broke down. Right there on the sidewalk in front of the cheap hotel, with Richard by my side, I burst into uncontrollable tears. They were 40 years of suppressed emotions, for days of uncertainty and despair, a lifetime of being told I was never enough. It all poured out in wrenching sobs. He said nothing more. He didn't try to silence me or offer empty words of comfort. He simply took my suitcase in one hand and wrapped his other arm around me as I crumbled against his chest. He smelled of expensive cologne and freshly laundered clothes, of success and stability, of everything I had lost and never truly had. The sweater felt soft against my cheek, and his strong arms held my trembling shoulders. "I'm sorry," I managed to say between gasps, my broken voice muffled against his chest. "I'm sorry, Richard. I shouldn't have called. I shouldn't have dragged you into this mess." "Sure," he murmured as his hand gently stroked my back. "You should have called years ago." When the tears finally subsided, I pulled away slightly, embarrassed by the damp stain I had left on his clothes. "I must look like a wreck," I whispered. He reached out and wiped away a stray tear slipping down my cheek, his gesture as delicate as a whisper. "You look like someone who has been through hell and survived. That's not a wreck, Mary. That's strength." I laughed weakly, though the sound came out trembling and bitter. "Strength? I'm 65 years old, staying in a second-rate hotel because my own son doesn't want me. That's not strength, that's pathetic." His jaw tightened, and for an instant I saw the flash of anger he tried to restrain. "Your son is a fool. You don't know him," I replied. "I don't need to know him, I know you." He paused, his hands still resting gently on my shoulders. "Or at least I once did." And when he spoke my maiden name, as if it were a treasure he had kept all these years, my chest filled with a deep longing for the woman I used to be. "That was a long time ago. I'm not that girl anymore," I murmured. Perhaps he didn't agree, but he answered, "I'd like to know the woman you've become." Then he placed my suitcase in the trunk of his luxury car with care, as if it were a valuable object and not a simple bag containing the little I had left in the world. As he opened the passenger door for me, I froze for a few seconds at the surrealism of the situation. That very morning before the fire, I had a house, memories, an entire life built over decades. And now I was stepping into the car of a man I hadn't seen in 40 years, with no idea of what would happen next. "Where are we going?" I asked when he started the engine. "Home," he replied simply. The drive lasted almost an hour, passing through increasingly exclusive neighborhoods, until we reached an area unfamiliar to me. Hills covered with estates hidden behind stone walls and iron gates. The trees looked as though they had been carefully planted by professionals, and the mailboxes were more expensive than most people's cars. Richard turned onto a long driveway marked only by a brass plaque with the name Anderson engraved on it. The road wound between tall trees and manicured gardens before opening into a circular entrance in front of a house that left me breathless. It was not ostentatious or excessive. It was elegant in the truest sense of old money, discreet, solid, built to endure. Made of stone and wood, with tall windows that caught the afternoon light and a porch that invited you to sit and watch the passing of time. "Richard," I whispered as I took in that monument to everything he had achieved. "This is incredible." He parked the car but didn't get out immediately. He sat for a moment looking at the house, as though seeing it through my eyes. "It's too big," he said quietly. "It always has been. I built it thinking someday I would fill it." He shrugged with a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache. "Some dreams don't end the way we imagine." "You never married?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. He looked at me with an expression hard to decipher. "I came close a couple of times, but something was always missing." He hesitated a moment and finally added with a calm voice, "That something was you." The word hung in the quiet car, heavy with 40 years of doubts, of missed possibilities, of questions that had never been answered. I wanted to understand what it meant, how I could have been absent from a life I never shared, but before I could speak, he had already stepped out to open my door. The inside of the house was even more impressive. The hardwood floors gleamed like freshly poured honey, the ceilings were high, and the furniture looked like it belonged in an architecture magazine. Yet the place did not feel cold or museum-like. There were books everywhere, comfortable chairs by the windows, photographs scattered on side tables. It radiated the feeling of a lived-in home, not just a showcase of success. "Are you hungry?" Richard asked, guiding me into a kitchen larger than my old living room. "I was about to make lunch when you called." I realized then how hungry I was. The hotel breakfast had been a piece of stale bread and watery coffee, and my stomach twisted from the mixture of emptiness and nerves. "I don't want to trouble you," I began, but he stopped me with a firm look. "Marry enough. You are not a burden. You are." He paused, searching for the right words. "You are the answer to a question I have been asking myself for 40 years. As Richard moved around that enormous kitchen, cooking with the ease of someone who had long ago learned to take care of himself, I watched his every move and at the same time let my eyes wander over the photographs decorating the space. In them, he appeared at ribbon-cutting ceremonies with giant scissors, shaking hands with politicians, businessmen, and well-known figures. In other images, he was with women at charity galas, at business dinners, always smiling for the camera, but never showing true happiness in his eyes. "Tell me about your life," Richard said as he set down a plate of perfectly roasted chicken with vegetables in front of me, filling the room with a delicious aroma. "I want to hear about Robert, about your son Michael, about everything I've missed all these years." For a moment I felt overwhelmed, but then I began to talk. And during that lunch, which tasted like heaven after the terrible meals I'd had at the hotel, I told him my story. I spoke of my marriage to Robert, a stable and reliable man who gave me security, a house, companionship, and loyalty, but never passion or big dreams. I told him about Michael, the son I had longed for, the boy I loved with all my strength, who over the years became distant, a man who chose the comfort of Sarah over the needs of his own mother. I recounted how I had spent decades trying to be a good wife, then a good mother, later a good widow, fulfilling what was expected of me. I told him about the fire that destroyed everything I owned, and how my own son turned his back on me in my worst moment, taking away not only a roof but also the last hope of family I had left. Richard listened without interrupting, his amber eyes fixed on my face the entire time. When I finished, he stayed silent for a few seconds that felt eternal. "I'm sorry," he finally said with a deep voice. "I'm sorry for Robert, for your house, for your son. But in spite of it all, I don't regret that you called me." "Why?" I asked, my voice sounding smaller and more fragile than I wanted. He stretched out his hand across the table and took mine. His fingers were still firm, still warm, still capable of making my heart race, even after so much time. "Because I never stopped loving you," he confessed calmly. "Because every business I started, every success I achieved, every dollar I earned, I did it all thinking of being worthy of you if you ever came back." "Richard, this sounds insane. It's been 40 years. We're different people now." "I know," he nodded. "I know it's a long time, but when I heard your voice on the phone today, it felt like a missing piece suddenly fell back into place." I looked down at our joined hands, his tanned and well cared for, mine marked by the years, by hard work, showing every day of my 65 years. "I'm not the girl you remember," I whispered. "You're better," he replied without hesitation. "You're real, authentic. You've loved, you've lost, you've suffered, and yet you're still standing. That 25-year-old girl was pretty, yes, but she was just a project, a promise. You are the woman that project became." His words settled into me like a warm blanket, covering wounds I hadn't even known were still open. For the first time in a long while, I felt truly seen. Not as a mother, not as a wife, not as a burden, but as what I had always been myself. "And now what?" I asked in a murmur. Richard smiled. That same devastating smile that had made me fall in love with him when the world was young, and I still believed everything was possible. "Now we discover what the rest of our life together will be. If that's what you want." In that beautiful kitchen, surrounded by good food and photographs that spoke of success and lost years, I realized something. Sometimes the fire that destroys your old life only clears the ground for the one you were truly meant to have. Living with Richard was like reconnecting with a part of myself I had completely forgotten. The first week was strange, filled with polite silences, as if we were two strangers sharing the same space. He gave me an entire guest suite, a room larger than my old living room, a private bathroom with a bathtub big enough for two, and a small sitting area with windows overlooking the gardens. I felt as if I were in a luxury hotel, afraid to leave any trace of my presence. But Richard was patient. Patient in the way only men who have learned to wait know how to be. Little by little I began to relax. He had Linda, the woman who had worked as his housekeeper for years, coming 3 days a week. On the other days I cooked for him myself. I started with small things. Making coffee in the mornings, preparing simple lunches. But Richard appreciated every gesture as if it were extraordinary. "This is wonderful," he told me one night, savoring a stew I had made with a recipe from my grandmother. "I can't remember the last time I tasted something so genuine." "It's nothing special," I answered, embarrassed. But inside I glowed because it had been so long since anyone valued my cooking. Michael used to complain that I always repeated the same 5 dishes. Sarah once suggested disdainfully that I should modernize my style. But Richard shook his head, smiling. "It's perfect. You're perfect." That word should have made me uncomfortable. Me with my gray roots showing, my marked wrinkles, my age-spotted hands, and a body that had lost its firmness. Me who felt far from perfect. And yet in Richard's eyes I saw reflected a woman worthy of love, tenderness, and care. Over time we fell into routines that became as natural as breathing. We had breakfast on the back porch. He leafing through company reports, me watching the birds at the feeders. In the afternoons we walked the grounds. He showed me the gardens he had planted himself, the greenhouse where he grew orchids, his secret passion. And at night we talked. We had 40 years to catch up on, and we did it patiently like archaeologists recovering pieces of a forgotten treasure. I told him how hard it was to lose Robert, the emptiness his absence left, the days when I could barely find the strength to get out of bed, the loneliness of widowhood, the feeling of being treated like half a person. He shared his story with me, how he had started with a small construction company and gradually built it into an empire with projects in several cities. He also told me about the women he had dated. Smart, admirable women, perfect in anyone's eyes, but who had never managed to make him feel complete. "There was a woman," Richard confessed one stormy night as we sat by the fireplace, rain pounding on the windows. "Mary. She was an architect, brilliant, beautiful. Everyone said we were the perfect couple." I felt a stab of jealousy so sharp it surprised me. "And what happened?" I asked softly. "I asked her to marry me," he replied calmly. "It was Christmas Eve 5 years ago. I planned everything. A restaurant with a view of the city, an expensive ring, the perfect setting. She accepted, and we set the wedding for the following summer. But as the date drew closer, that feeling inside me grew stronger. She wasn't the problem. She was everything anyone could want in a wife. The problem was me." He paused, staring at the fire. "The night before the wedding, I canceled it." "Richard, what did you tell her?" He fixed his serious, honest eyes on me. "I told her I was still in love with a woman I had met 40 years ago, and that it wouldn't be fair to marry her when my heart belonged to someone else." His words hit me with indescribable force. "You canceled your wedding because of me? Because of the memory of what we once were? Because of the chance that someday I might need you and you'd still be here waiting?" I looked at him, unable to understand how this successful, sought-after man had given all that up for a ghost, for me. "It's madness," I whispered. "Yes, it is," he answered, leaning toward me and taking my hands. "As mad as you carrying my business card in your wallet for 40 years. And he was right. We were both crazy, prisoners of the ghosts of the past. But somehow, against all logic, that shared madness had brought us together again. 3 weeks after I had moved into Richard's home, I received a call from Michael. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming to myself, something I hadn't done in years, when suddenly my phone rang. Seeing my son's name on the screen, I felt my stomach clench with anxiety. "Hello, sweetheart," I answered, trying to keep my voice calm. "Mom," he replied in a strange, carefully measured tone. "I've been trying to call you, but your phone always goes straight to voicemail." It was true. I had been avoiding many calls, not feeling strong enough to face the guilt or pressure Michael might lay on me. "I've been busy," I murmured. "Busy with what?" he pressed. "I heard you haven't been at the hotel for weeks. Where are you living?" I glanced around Richard's bright, elegant kitchen, at the fresh flowers he had brought that morning and the wine glasses on the counter. "I'm staying with a friend," I replied. "What friend?" Michael shot back incredulously. "Mom, you don't have friends with money. His comment hurt, maybe because for years it had been true. Since Robert's death I had grown isolated, too tired and proud to maintain friendships when I had nothing to offer in return. "What if I surprise you?" I answered coldly. There was a pause. I could almost hear him processing the information. "Mom, I think we need to talk," he continued. "Sarah and I have been thinking, and maybe we were too harsh. If you want, you could stay in the guest room for a while, until you get back on your feet." An offer that a month earlier would have meant the world to me now sounded hollow, even insulting. "What made you change your mind?" I asked. Another pause. We realized we might have been too focused on ourselves. Family needs to stick together. What he really meant was that word had probably reached him, through neighborhood gossip, that his mother was no longer alone in a cheap hotel but in the company of an elegant man who picked her up in a luxury car. Michael was curious, and that curiosity had made him generous. "How kind of you," I answered calmly. "But I'm fine where I am." "Mom, you can't just move in with a stranger. It's not safe." "What do you know about this man?" "I know he's never made me feel like a burden," I answered quietly. "I know he values my company, enjoys my cooking, and tells me every day that I'm beautiful." The wedding with Richard was nothing like the first one I had celebrated with Robert 4 decades earlier. Back then, everything revolved around what others expected. The white dress, the church ceremony, the banquet in the community hall with a DJ and an open bar. We invited half the world, even people we didn't really like, because that was how it was done. It was a ritual for others, not for us. This time we decided to do everything our own way. The ceremony was held in Richard's garden on a crisp November morning, 5 months after that phone call at the hotel. The pastor was an old friend of his, and the only witnesses were Linda, his housekeeper, and James, his partner and best friend for 25 years. I wore a simple blue dress that, according to Richard, brought out the color of my eyes. He wore a gray suit that made him look distinguished, without ostentation or exaggeration. We were just two people reunited after 4 decades, promising to share whatever life we had left. Michael attended the wedding. I hesitated a lot about inviting him, but Richard convinced me. "He's your son," he said calmly. "You'll regret it if you don't give him another chance." 2 weeks before the ceremony, I called him and spoke directly. "Richard and I are getting married on November 15th at 2 o'clock. You're invited, but Sarah is not." That day he arrived alone, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than I would spend on groceries for an entire month. He greeted Richard with a proper handshake, said little, and even smiled when the pastor pronounced us husband and wife. Yet I could see in his eyes how he was measuring every detail. Richard's house, his car, the obvious signs of wealth. The next morning I woke in the arms of my husband, in the room we now shared, in the house that had become our home. Sunlight streamed through the windows that overlooked the gardens we cared for together, and I could smell the coffee Richard always prepared before I woke up. At 66, I found myself happier than ever. Not because of Richard's wealth, nor his beautiful house, nor his success, but because finally someone truly saw me and chose to love me for who I was. The fire had consumed my old life, reducing it to ashes. But sometimes destruction is only another form of renewal. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what you truly need. And if you're lucky, your first love can become the love of your life. The business card I had kept for 40 years now hangs framed on Richard's desk. A reminder that there are promises worth keeping, even if they take decades to fulfill. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next stories. And if you'd like to support us even more, consider becoming a member. You'll gain access to exclusive content and help this community grow. Thank you for staying with us until the end.